The member for Goldstein in Melbourne, Tim Wilson, who also heads up Parliament's Economic and Finance Committee. Thanks for joining us, Tim. I want to come to your thoughts soon on interest rates, particularly as it affects retirees. But a question without notice first. You know a lot about climate change. You know a lot about the science. You accept the science. You know what Australia's doing. You know what the rest of the world's doing. You know what the natural history of this country is. So let's get your thoughts on some of the nutty claims we're getting at the moment and these attempts by political and other activists to suggest that the government is somehow responsible for bushfires.
Well, we know the government isn't responsible for bushfires. State governments actually do have quite a significant contribution around making sure there's bushfire prevention, around clearing undergrowth and the like. People are making a lot of allegations, some of which, frankly, I haven't had the time to assess or test properly. But what we do know is that there have always been bushfires. We know we have a responsibility to put them out. We know we have a series of prevention strategies that state governments should be implementing. People have raised concerns about whether they have done enough of that, particularly around undergrowth. And frankly, I think the focus needs to be proportionate and discussed, but also make sure that we take care of the people whose homes are actually burning around them and support them.
Yeah, but we've also got to call out the nonsense that's being put out, don't we? The suggestion from Greens and the other activists, former fire chiefs today, that somehow Australia can do something that will make our summers milder.
Well, I haven't seen those comments, but what we know is that the challenge around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is not one that's a local one, it's a global one, meaning every country in the world needs to carry their weight. What we know is that obviously Australia is a small proportion, as we've discussed on this program before. Just because you're small doesn't mean you don't have a contribution. One of the reasons I'm a Liberal is because I believe in responsibility.
Sure, no, we all agree. Well, some of us agree that you've got to do something, but the point, and that's fine, and you do something so that you hope everyone does something, but we also know, sorry, just the point to comment on is that global emissions are continuing to grow substantially.
Correct, and that's why saying that Australia acting unilaterally is going to solve this problem is false. We can't actually address all of these problems in isolation. It's got to be part of a global cooperative effort. Yeah,
indeed. So deal with your climate policy, deal with those issues, deal with bushfire management and fuel hazard reduction burns and the like, but let's not have this overlapping. It's ugly political opportunism, in my view. Now, I want to go to this issue, Tim, where you're a bit of a hero, really, to retired Australians because of the work you did in the lead up to the election on franking credits. But now you're pointing out that the Reserve Bank continually lowering what are already historically low interest rates is really hurting people who are living off their savings.
That's true, but the point I was bringing forward is evidence, not what I think, not what the Reserve Bank thinks. It's actually what the banks are actually doing. As part of our House of Representatives Economics Committee, we actually asked the banks, what is the actual pass-through or follow-through from interest rate cuts? And what they basically showed was that unless you asked for an interest rate cut, you didn't get it. And so the dollar value is pretty small. Some banks, it was only 0.4% of customers had actually asked for an interest rate cut, while if every time you renew a term deposit or take a new one out for the first term, you basically get the full interest rate cut passed through. So less money is going out, but often a lot of the same money is going into the bank.
It's the same old story, isn't it, with banks? We find them very quick to increase interest rates on mortgages if it moves in that direction, but slow passing them on the other way.
Well, that's partly true, but people get reductions in their principal repayments as a trade-off. But the real question is, are interest rate cuts actually delivering the effective stimulus into the economy? And I think that's where my focus is, and I'm not convinced it is. That's the question, the underlying assumption that sits behind the RBA. Every time it cuts its interest rate, the assumption is there's more money in people's hip pockets. They go off and spend. In fact, in some banks' cases, it basically shows there's virtually no change, because once you take into account how little money comes off people's mortgage repayments, but how much comes off people's term deposits and the like and other interest-bearing deposits, it essentially makes it neutral. So we actually get no stimulus or limited stimulus.
Yeah, and all the evidence is there to demonstrate that, even in things like the employment figures today. We're just not getting the bang out of those monetary policy moves. Just on that, What are your thoughts on deeming rates? A lot of understandable resentment about deeming rates being so high, given that real interest rates are so low.
Well, the Treasurer has made improvements on the deeming rates in light of the fact there's been interest rate cuts. But every time we do that, obviously it costs money from the budget. And we went to the election with a very clear commitment that we would honour a budget surplus. And so it sits as part of a package of things the government has to consider. But it's also the case about why the RBA should think very carefully about the consequences of the decisions they're making, because we're not talking about reducing interest rates from 8% to 7%. We're talking about them going from 1.5% down to 0.75%.
And just finally then, what do you do? What are the options now to try and stimulate the economy? We hear that Josh Frydenberg's going to talk about tax breaks for overseas investors in big projects in Australia, resisting calls for even more government infrastructure spending, and everyone's nervous about what the global outlook is.
Well, that's right, and that's a good case for why stability and certainty is so important. That's why the budget surplus is so critical, because it gives confidence to the market to say that Australia has its financial affairs in order, and we're going to make sure that we're doing so. We obviously have delivered a series of tax cuts, and they will continue to wash through the economy over the coming months. Obviously, we've got a new budget that's going to come up next year, and that will provide a new opportunity to refresh looking at what we need to do in the space of tax. Yes, in addition to the $100 billion of infrastructure investment, but other plans around how we do it. But it's not just up to the Commonwealth, frankly. It's also up to the states. The states are obviously spending a lot on infrastructure, or certainly some states are, but they have their own tax-based problems that they've got to address if they want to deliver certainty to the markets too.
Thanks for joining us, Tim.